So I'll be last on stage.
Good morning, everyone. You might recognize me. I've been on stage 5 minutes before, so welcome again. After this morning's news about the AI omnibus, we now are going to turn to the technology that actually underpins almost everything, that is chips. And maybe it's too early for you to already open a bag of chips, but I still hope you enjoy this panel. For decades, Europe's position in the chips value chain has been declining, and the Commission made a pitch 2 years ago to change that with the first Chips Act. And at the end of the month, we already expect a second one, the second Chips Act. So no better time to talk about chips than now, I would say. And we're going to do that with 3 esteemed speakers. First of all, we have 2 European Parliament lawmakers. Bart Groothuis from the Netherlands and Eva Majdal from Bulgaria. And then we have Jo de Boek, who is Executive Vice President at Belgian Chips R&D Center IMEC in Leuven, not so far from here. Welcome all. This session has a Q&A part, so if you have questions, prepare them. Not a statement, please, but a question. Eva, I first want to turn to you still about the AI omnibus, not about chips.
I'm afraid I didn't hear your discussion earlier. Oh, but please turn to me.
But still, you, of course, digested this morning deal, I can imagine already on your way here. Are you a happy person? Is this satisfactory to power AI adoption and deployment in Europe?
Well, look, I always called upon the Commission, and I think already back last year at this similar summit, that we need to be better in our communication of what we want, and we also need to understand that should our companies are not prepared to meet certain deadlines, or should our companies, we believe there's too much overlap, this has to be the way forward. So in this respect, I believe we have delivered from the perspective of European Parliament to the demands of the European stakeholders in this case. Yes.
Bart, I saw you nodding no when I asked the question. You're very skeptical, yeah.
So the European Chips Act, we'll be discussing it later. It'll only be effective if there's a sovereign demand for advanced AI chips, and the sovereign demand must be created. We'll talk about that later. One of the things we need is a European LLM to be built in Europe, compliant. And if I build with LLM makers, if I speak with European AI builders, they all say the same. So with the current legislation, and what I heard from you this morning, that will not significantly change, we cannot build European LLMs. Yeah. And this is the problem. I mean, this is not a technology. This is decisive for our future. So we need it in Europe, and we need to deregulate much, much faster than we're doing now.
Are you then going to vote against the trilogue deal?
I'm not sure. I need to see what the text is. What Merz did on industrial AI, I really commend that. But for business to consume AI, I can imagine there's still huge obstacles to form European large language models. I mean, we have AI gigafactories. Who will use them? Yeah. Okay, who will use? Where's the demand? Yeah.
Let's get into that later, but keep in mind that Renew is still doubtful about the deal. Interesting. So chips, the first Chips Act, again, as I said, was adopted 3 years ago, also set the goal for Europe to claim 20% of the global chips value chain. We're now 3 years later, and we're still at 10%. We're nowhere near the targets. We're going for a second one, but that doesn't sound like a resounding success to me, the first Chips Act. So yeah, Eva, I want to maybe start with you, because you were one of the lead negotiators on the file at the time. What is your assessment of the first Chips Act? Was it a success, or is it a total failure?
Well, back then I used to refer to the Chips Act as a strategic vision coming out of the European Commission. Why do I say that? Is because what the Commission back then tried to do, and we tried to shape it in the Parliament, also Bart was involved in those negotiations, we tried to shape a little bit what should happen in the next coming years on our continent. It was in a way a necessary strategic shift. I think it marked the departure from Europe's traditional reluctance to use industrial policy and place semiconductors at the center of economic security and competitiveness. However, of course, the limitations of Chips Act 1 are very clear. The act was heavily focused on subsidizing large-scale manufacturing projects, something that I warned against at the time, which risked pulling Europe into a global global subsidy competition and a global subsidy race in very uncertain with very uncertain economic returns. So I think in practice what happened is that Europe was competing for a small number of global players, often at a high cost and with limited long-term leverage. I think it exposed also a lot of our structural weaknesses. First of all, we saw that funding remains limited. It is also, so to say, in the investments that are concerned were always in few locations. There was sometimes a competition between our own member states instead of finding a vision of how to attract investment together, and that came, in a way without sufficiently covering the full value chain, especially when it comes to design, when it comes to materials and the downstream industrial integration.
I want to go a bit into the full value chain by also focusing on R&D. There was also a part in the first CHIPS Act that really wanted to boost R&D. IMEC was one of the beneficiaries. It got 700 million in EU funding for a new pilot line for the most advanced chips. Would you say that with the first CHIPS Act that Europe is now well positioned to still be a player in this race, or is it still falling short?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And again, our position is at R&D, and therefore I think the panel, I think. Complementing Eva's comments here, CHIPS Act 1 had a few pillars. Pillar 1 was on R&D, strengthening the strengths of Europe in that sense. And so if you look globally, Europe has a very strong play in R&D, actually supported by the member states for many years. The good thing about Pillar 1 in the CHIPS Act is it brought a lot of those strengths together and it doubled down on it. And you mentioned the level of investment, because indeed also R&D in this sector is very expensive. It's expensive in building the technology, but it also requires the look through the full stack. And I think that's what Pillar 1 also does. There's a chip design platform in addition to the pilot lines. The important thing there as well, there's no such thing as a chip, and there's many of them. And we'll see strengths in Europe today as well in some of the chips that will be quintessential for the AI of the future, will be also physical AI, and looking, to be present in all aspects of our lives. So you'll need chips to perceive and to interact with the environments, with us, with robotics, etc. But you need the ones that think as well. And so in that sense, there is this set of pilot lines that look at photonics, at quantum coming up. We're looking at power devices, essentially for the industry and all robotics around, but just for the energy grid, essential components. And then, of course, you look at chips that will enable the thinking part of the AI system. And that's, of course, where the technology, if you look across, is very expensive to build. But once built, it needs to be a launching pad. It needs to be a platform. And so there's where design comes in. And that's something, that full stack idea that you brought, and actually Bart referred to it, you need to create demand, but demand has different forms and form factors and different industry players. So what the pilot lines can do is not only, but very importantly, stimulate the youngsters to come into the domain and get access to the most advanced technology sites and settings. Very important. One element of the pilot lines is train and act on training. The second one is enable the design community to look ahead. And as a innovator or tech creator, as currently said, all these companies, but also the researchers and the developers and the startup founders alike need access to these platforms. But they need to be able to look ahead. Yeah. And that's what pilot lines can do. They stimulate Pillar 2, which Eva was referring to be a bit more ambitious. We'll come to CHIPS Act 2, to be a bit more ambitious to make sure that you create this European network as a foundational platform for the industrialization.
Bart, I already hear your two colleague speakers speaking a lot about the full stack, not just focusing on manufacturing. I remember from the first CHIPS Act, though, that then digital chief Thierry Breton was really focused on having talks with, for example, Intel, TSMC, getting those players here to build a shiny factory. Would you argue that the Commission is too focused on manufacturing or getting those factories to that manufacturing capacity here? And do you expect that to change in the second CHIPS Act?
It was a political stunt, the 20%, but it was a good stunt. I understand the focus on the 2-nanometer factory in Europe. Why? Because of the US and the diffusion act,
advanced
AI
chips.
diffusion rule. And it's not Donald Trump. That was Joe Biden in his last week in office. He put forward an AI diffusion rule saying Europe cannot buy the latest Gladwell H200 B20 chips of NVIDIA. We're being colonized, dear friends. This is colonization. If we want to build our own large language models with those gigafactories, whatever, and we can only buy Americans' kit, or the Americans will only buy it for American companies, we are dependent on American large language models, we will completely be dependent on American AI. And that is a problem as such. So, of course, we need 2-nanometer factory in Europe. That's good. The Intel failed in Magdeburg, and I guess we need a new project there. But the focus, I fully agree, should be much, much broader. The huge benefits for our economy will be in fabless design. And I fully agree with what Jo just said, and Eva, you also mentioned it. Design is of core essence, and we can do that. The fabless grow, that is the biggest added value we can give to Europe. We have great companies in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, Accelera AI in Eindhoven. They are the biggest competitor for inference chips for NVIDIA. They can do it, and we can get a large chunk of that market, and there's the biggest growth.
Yeah. But if we really need a sovereign advanced chips factory in Europe, how do we need to, that costs a lot of money, it's a big price tag, how do we need to do this? Eva, you already mentioned funding and that there was a bit of a subsidy race. How do you avoid that when you want to build or have that kind of advanced chip manufacturing capacity?
So first of all, I'll go a step backwards. I know this is particularly a panel focused about chips and the CHIPS Act too. However, I think still, and I've always warned about that, and I feel like, 30 years ago when we used to have cassette recorders, I have to constantly over-repeat it. I kind of think that we look at a lot of those files in silos, and I do believe that the CHIPS Act 2 has to be about, seen as the broader digital jigsaw, about alignment, about simplification, about streamlining. It's about economic security. It's about how we can attract investments. If you want to speak again about a fab, it's about permitting. It's so many things put together. But I think the only way Europe can ultimately be successful in the value chain is not to be self-sufficient, but to be indispensable, to make sure that there are certain parts of the value chain where we as Europeans are indispensable, where we cannot be bypassed in the value chain. And where that can be is to look at the gaps and to use them and to seize the opportunity. It's about manufacturing, it's about design capabilities, it's about system level integration. And I think if we again move the debate into a simplistic way of saying we're going to build this one fab here, and this is how we're going to make sure we're indispensable, I think this is the wrong approach to go. And then in a way we'll be trying to replicate what the CHIPS Act 1 aims and goals were. And another thing that we don't really talk about, and no one really wants to say that, and at another panel where you were moderating, we talked about it. I think it's also about the mindset change and the operational change in our institutions. We thought not I, didn't think about that, but the majority of the institutional people involved said, the moment we deliver and put a tick on the CHIPS Act, our job is done, and miraculously everything will happen in Europe. So if we just think that with a piece of document we're going to fix the problem, the actual work starts only afterwards.
That's
so
a good message for the Commission.
We'll need targeted initiatives that would secure that those goals and aims that we're going to put into the CHIPS Act are actually going to happen.
I know I don't have to obsess on this advanced chips factory, but I still have one question for you about it, Jo. There's a persistent rumor in Brussels that IMEC is in a way already a bit involved in preparing the groundwork for this sovereign advanced chips factory that will be part of the second Chips Act.
Well, if you look at our position, IMEC and our colleagues in France and Germany, we always have been at that foundation layer. We push technology forward, we push it to the edge, to the leading edge. We've had a collaboration with ASML since 1987, 88, persistently pushing the envelope. And that's where, of course, when you talk about rumors, we are very close to the industry in global to make sure that we understand, first of all, where the technology could be going and then make it real. So in a sense, again, that foundational layer, that platform is there to build upon. I mean, we are not the ones that produce. Everyone will know this, and please, reach out to visit the infrastructure. You'll be wowed with what there is, but this is not a production facility. This will enable new prototyping potentially for certain parts of the technology, and it will shed light again on where designers can go. And I think that outlook is going to be so important. And just to add on this infrastructure doesn't make much sense if you can't make it to use to build the architectures. And again, I'm pounding on this. We have teams, we have collaborations with the industry, but Accelera was mentioned, one of those startups. We need to make sure that, first of all, they can have the insight, and maybe early on, that's where the gain of CHIPS Acts could be, subsidizing for some part the look-ahead portion, but then make sure that the investments and indispensability is one thing, attractiveness is another. Make Europe attractive for the Acceleras and Open Chips and others of this part of the continent to grow, to scale. And the good thing, and it's maybe a final comment, AI is changing daily. We all know this, right? And we see the impact of it. But that also means that there are opportunities. And for instance, the pilot lines can offer new technology features that when we can demonstrate their use to the design and architecture community, they can pick it up fast. They can move and they can Schumpeter the existing play. And so therefore, I think the optimism I hope I radiate here is that we do have this chance. And then acts need to make it a bit more attractive. We need to have the carrot and the stick maybe to make sure that the European market, and let's be honest, we have a large market for all of this for years to come, and it's going to be extremely expensive to continue to buy things which do not contribute to our wealth. So we need to make sure that there is this connection, and that is typically enabled by policy, and it's out of my comfort zone here, but that's where we will contribute. We will be
I want to go a bit further on what you said about indispensability. Europe also has a leverage in the chips value chain. There are some strengths like IMEC, but also ASML, the well-known Dutch chip printing machine maker. The US and China, they have shown that they were very willing to weaponize chips supply chain. Should Europe do that as well? Should we say maybe we shouldn't ship ASML machines anymore to the US and China if they're weaponizing the supply chains themselves? What do you think about that? Let's do that or not?
No, that's a way too broad question. First of all, I don't think that export control should be in Parliament. I think it should be a sovereign decision for the executive branch. Second of all, what you said, Jo, was the core of what needs to be done. There needs to be a demand created. That's what lacked in the previous CHIPS Act. We can set our own European powers, much more than competing in the way that you're asking with China and the US. We should set our own policies here, much more important. And I guess that the EU CHIPS Act as such will do nothing without the savings union. It will do nothing without the Cloud and AI Development Act. The EU CHIPS Act will do nothing without the 28 regime.
Now you're dodging my question, because my question was really should it be part of the toolbox to also, as Europe, as the Commission, weaponize chip supply chains and say okay, maybe ASML printers shouldn't go to China anymore, or to...
That's already practice, okay, Peter? So the DUV machines and the Americans are pushing and...
or to the US. That's currently still happening.
No, of course not. That is not on the table, and it shouldn't be on the table. We should have good relations with our friends. And I guess that the most powerful thing that we can do is build our own posture. That's what our debate should be about. I'm not going to be speaking about export controls to the US. That's ridiculous. We can't build chips without the US. The US can't build chips without us. That's an indispensable relationship we have to be very aware of. So if the US ambassador here in Brussels says we will be all prepared for an all-out trade war if we don't sign the Turnberry deal ASAP, then my first question is, what are you looking at if you're looking at chips? Have you thought about what could happen there? And they obviously haven't, right? They obviously haven't. I'm not saying we should weaponize it, but they should think about this more clearly than they did thus far.
Eva, what are you thinking about that? Because you're also on the EU-US Parliament delegation. This is also part of should that be part of the considerations or not?
Well, once again, I think these are very complex debates that have been sized down to a very simplistic, should we, yes or no. It's partially because the narrative is such. We live in an era of which narrative is stronger, who gives more interviews, who speaks first. I think we as Europe are very weak on that part, and we need to realize that and see whether we want to change anything or continue to be on the receiving end of the narrative and not shape the narrative. Having said that, I've always thought that we need to be much more considerate in our economic security strategy. I don't think we have a coherent economic security strategy, and when to use the sticks and when that is necessary. We always say we are prepared. We rarely do, but I think we need to be much more aware. But in the same time, I'm a convinced transatlantist. I do believe we need to continue finding ways how to cooperate, and in the end, the narrative of others might be stronger and louder, but then in practice, it not always delivers. So I think we need to be just a little bit more strategic again, when to use the sticks when it's necessary.
But now we're speaking about EU-US relations. Part of the EU-US trade deal was also that Europe would buy a lot of AI chips from the US. That's also not really incentivizing the own industry or the own R&D labs to come up with own production.
But it's not so simplistic. I think, as I said, I mean, it's you know, if we just have fabs and we produce chips, and if we don't have demand, I mean, I don't think is that simple. And I think probably the chips discussion is one of the most complex discussions within the tech arena. And I think we oversimplify it
so the core question
in debates of 45 minutes.
The core question is, where will the demand come from? And it's from the Cloud and AI Development Act in its core. So Europe should be able to grab a portion of the market. Government is first buyer with Government Procurement Act, saying we want a European cloud, and we want to legislate that, the demand for policymakers, like Jo said, then we want to make sure that demand comes from Europe. It doesn't mean the entire American AI hyperscales will be pushed out. It means a small portion, government as first buyer, will create a market for European players. And it will be sovereign demand, and it will be made in Europe cloud. That will create the business case for production. That will create an incentive for TSMC or Samsung or Intel to create a new fab here. That is the core and the essence that was missing in the first CHIPS Act. And what I say is this CHIPS Act, without the savings union, will do nothing, because if you want to scale, design companies like Accelera, they can grab money they can create money from European VC up till 200, 300 million. That's easy. Not easy, but it's doable. If you want 2, 3 billion, over $1 billion, they need American VC or from the Middle East. That's the problem. The savings union is equally important for the CHIPS Act, and then there's just...
But then you're already saying that it won't make the cut, the next CHIPS Act, because the savings and investment union is not there. So.
And the 28th regime the same. We need to have investments in Europe. We cannot scale.
Do you have the feeling in your exchanges with the Commission, which you probably have on the second CHIPS Act, that they get this idea of demand, of that it should be demand-driven?
I had a conversation with the Commission even last night, and I guess they're on the right track. But the demand creation should be demand creation from business case-orientated thinking, and not like we have AI gigafactories, that is demand. That is not demand. Who will demand the...
But that's the case the Commission is making. They say like the AI gigafactories... So that's false.
So if I see Oracle, NVIDIA, and OpenAI forming a closed loop in the US and have a closed loop of cooperation, a self-funding system of demand creation, that's something I would like to see. That is what the cloud AI development could reach as well. But you have to think in business cases. And thinking like an open loop, like we have an AI gigafactory and let's see what happens, that's not a business case. That's not how Europe will, like Baron Munchausen, will pull itself out of the swamp.
That's a clear warning to the Commission, like don't count on the AI gigafactories alone to...
I just came back from Japan.
Yeah.
And that's the same.
Let's talk about that later.
Okay.
I really want to go to you, Jo, really quickly, because I hear a lot of quotes here about business cases, making sure that industry is on board with this. You, as an R&D lab, how do you make sure that you always connect to the industry and make sure that the product that you're still designing or conceptualizing that they're connected with that industry demand?
So the product vision typically comes from the industry or from the startups, right? I mean, sometimes people have a grandiose idea, we put them on the market, and then they need to scale. We'll come back to that potentially later. Scaling in Europe is not that easy. Exactly. But then, having said that, and coming to your question, Peter, we listen to the industry constantly. We work with them to understand what their challenges are. Of course, they will not tell us their greatest secrets, but they will tell us their dreams, right? And such a dream is never in isolation. If you talk to the cloud users, and there are, of course, cloud users. I mean, it's going to be tough to fill all the AI gigafactories that we will be building as of day one, but there will be an enabling platform to do so. And there are people around, there are large concerns around that will use and train models. And it will not be necessarily only LLM, it's an important part, but there's a lot of other foundational models that will support the financial industry, that will support the whole industry where more structured data is needed and other types of structured data than language, by the way, biology, life sciences. There's a huge demand for going to train stuff. And I think focusing only on LLM will also be a mistake, like focusing on any detail will be a mistake, like Eva said earlier as well. For us, indeed, coming again to your question, yes, we know through the full stack, through our discussion with all of these players, very much their dreams, their concerns, and how we, from the technology base, again, we need to be strong where we are, technology development, we see opportunities. And it does link to technology immediately, and it's very hard to understand how then rapidly this goes from the lab to the fab. But that's the focus of the pilot lines. We are building all of these technology features on an industry platform that can be taken up. And actually, I point to a 300 millimeter wafer. And again, this where the industry manufacturing is for most of the technologies. Of course, there's many chips on other platforms. But that said, it's a small step for the technology transfer. It's a huge step for industrialization. And you need to have the industry policy guiding it, carrot and stick, and then make sure that that resonates way up where people think about data, people think about service, about challenging healthcare, in automotive.
In the different verticals you mentioned, indeed. Yeah. I want to bring in another topic that really struck the chips world at the end of last year. That was the case of Nexperia. Nexperia is a Dutch-based yet Chinese-owned chip maker. The Dutch government intervened there, and there was, that really triggered a warning across the supply chain because there was suddenly all kinds of supply crunches. I was wondering, to what extent is couldn't the first CHIPS Act avoid that or prevent that? Because in the first CHIPS Act there was already a push to do some mapping to warn the value chain if there was some kind of shortage. Eva, you worked on this law. Shouldn't we be able to avoid something like the Nexperia case?
Well, I think this is a question to the semiconductor board probably, because part of that board work should be to be able to map out any vulnerabilities, any
but that clearly
issues.
didn't happen, or?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't heard a statement from them. Maybe there was one. I don't know. But that was the idea. When we put together the board, we also did ask them to have international participation in that board from our partners, to be able to not just focus on concrete issues in 1 or 2 or 3 member states or more, and not just to focus on the pillars themselves, but to be able to meet regularly, assess, discuss in a, in a closed door environment where more can be shared. To be honest, I don't have much information in order to be able
do you have
to.
More information?
But I
Because
think these boards cannot be just places where, on paper.
Yeah. Should we press, for example, because it was car makers who really issued warnings about, we don't have enough Nexperia chips anymore to build our cars. Should we press car makers to diversify more away from, maybe risky companies?
Well, sure.
Yeah.
Of course, obviously, car makers need to think through their supply chain. And this was, you asked, could the CHIPS Act prevent this? Well, of course not. Because, first of all, the CEO had malign intentions. An independent court in Amsterdam acknowledged that. Secondly, of course, the Dutch government intervened. And what you see then is that the Chinese government, with their very aggressive stance, pulled on all strings to stranglehold, to take the European industry into a stranglehold, because they don't want clawbacks like this. They want to demonstrate to the world how China will respond. No act can prevent a country from acting like this, because the conclusion for the end users should be diversify and move away from that Chinese model. And this
are you then saying like this shouldn't be a part of the second CHIPS Act?
Of course, it should be part of the CHIPS Act to incentivize that move.
Yeah.
And companies like Nexperia, especially, should be very welcomed if they could diversify without Chinese intervention, without Chinese control, but build mature node chips, which is needed for AI, is needed for AI stack, is needed for automotive, is needed for so many things in Europe, and especially the analog chips. The Americans are lobbying this week in Brussels. I've had them, you probably had them at your coffee as well, that Europe has a unique position in analog chips, and they are right. And Nexperia, once we can have a good conversation on it, without the Chinese controls, should be able to provide lots of that analog chips to the European industry again. But we should have the European industry, the CHIPS Act, incentivizing that.
Okay. There is another part of the world where we are heavily reliant on, and that's Taiwan. Taiwan is really a place where all the advanced chips are being manufactured. And of course, we know the threat of a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I was wondering, for example, IMEC, and you work with all the manufacturers. Are there contingency plans for whenever there is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Should Europe maybe have
I hope
one?
the contingency plans don't need to come from the RTOs. One thing that we do have is again, a very strong base. We have good collaborations, again, with these companies, and it's important to understand how this technology base comes to bear. How do we make this? It's based on excellence. It's based on working with the best. It's based on understanding where the challenges are, and this you do in collaboration. So the good thing is we do have strong collaboration indeed with these companies today that are globally pushing the envelope. I said that before, sorry for repeating this, but it's important because we get a lot of know-how built based on these interactions, and that is European know-how. We have that. We can build upon it, as I said before. The contingency plan, of course, lies in the fact that you industrialize this technology, this base. Can you do this in partnership? Please, because then you move faster. Should you do this in naivety? No. So you need to have a plan, an industrialization roadmap that goes through the whole stack. I think we're repeating this, but it's important to pound on this. So this interaction, contingency being built is make sure that you have the partnerships, and there's a lot of politics there, which I leave to the colleagues on stage. But there is an important part of being ready, enabling the whole community to be ready.
Yeah, but if you were an advisor to Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, would you say to her, like, prepare a chips contingency plan for whenever China invades Taiwan?
Well,
that's a yes or no question. That's not a...
It's a yes or no question. Yeah. I would say have a plan, yes, of course. I'm optimistic that, in CHIPS Act 2, the foundation there again for such a plan could be there. in solid partnerships, but with something to offer, right? Analog chips, very strong.
Yeah.
Photonics, quite
Let's turn to the
strong.
policy.
Design,
Yeah.
quite strong if we enable it. And we have the IP to work with. So let's do this.
Yeah, let's turn to policymakers. I'm also going to ask you the yes or no question. Should we have a Taiwan contingency plan?
Well, I mentioned economic security a number of times, so I clearly believe we need to have various contingency plans, whether on health-related issues, such as what COVID brought to us, whether on geopolitics and geoeconomics. Absolutely, I think we live in a new era, not just in industrial means, but also in geopolitics. And if we do not become more powerful, savvy, and better prepared, it's going to cost us much more and our societies as well.
Obviously, yes, but the best way of doing so is cooperating with Japan, Taiwan, far more intense than we already did.
Yeah.
And the best way of doing so is also incentivizing TSMC to make a business case for them to open fabs here. We need their capabilities here in Europe as well to strengthen our cooperation. And of course, we need contingency plans, but the best way also of doing it is to make sure that every optimism that President Xi has to grab Taiwan is to undermine that optimism. Putin was optimistic about Kiev, but being there in 3 weeks. Everyone's optimistic. Trump is optimistic about Iran. Undermining optimism of world leaders should be at the core of our policies.
I want to turn to the audience for a moment because I promised some Q&As. Oh, and I already see some hands being raised. Very much enthusiasm in the. There is one, over there. Please keep it short because we're short in time.
Thank you. My name is Irina Kupianen. I'm from CSC IT Center for Science. I also represent the Lumi AI Factory. I think the discussion is basically very technology-centric, and I would like to ask about the human factor. So technology in itself doesn't create impact, but we need people, and we need skilled people and people with better understanding of the implication, the application and development of technology. So what is your take on this? Because in the EU policy, they are in separate silos, basically, and I think the people and the skills should be an elementary part of the stack. Thank you.
So how do we get chips talent to Europe? Or how do we retain them?
It's about talent.
Talent,
right?
you mean?
Yeah.
And I'm currently amending, for your attention, the competitiveness fund for STEM. I mean, so the beta, the scientists that we need in the future to have huge projects in Europe from the European Competitiveness Fund into the skilled labor workers that we need. So, like I said, the AI Chips Act is nothing without a lot of surrounding legislative frameworks surrounding it.
Yeah, I do think we didn't pinpoint enough on talent indeed in this discussion, but we might have the infrastructure and the innovation, but if you don't have the talent, you can't scale that. And if you don't have the talent, it would be very difficult to have the innovation as well. So we clearly are, it's a mix. There's no way we can progress without talent. But again, I agree, as I said, it's a number of things that we need to be looking into. This is why this conversation poses so many challenges, I think, from an institutional perspective. And I do not think it's just the institutions that have to have, the EU institutions that have the answers. It's a big collaborative effort. And I think we did well with CHIPS Act 1 in, mapping out the ecosystem and bringing them more together and talking together. So some sort of a basis has been put in making sure that there's catering more to the different needs of the ecosystem. But of course, talent and the human-centric approach is central to any strategy
Maybe a question
that wants to
I would
scale.
like to add is how easy is it to hire for an RTO like AMIC?
Well, it's very difficult to just hire. That's why we also are deep in education. And STEM came up, and it's a very tough thing and a very tough nut to crack. Education is so important. But I'd like also, thanks for the question, by the way, because we should have brought up skills earlier in the debate, I guess. But it's skills throughout all layers of the economy, but also just our daily life. We need to skill every citizen in this. And I think that's the social aspect of it. If we do enable all of these platforms to be active, people will work with them. It will have impact, like every big technology shift. And so I think training the youngsters to become part of this is important, because otherwise we can't build the new economy. But once it's there, we will need to work with it. And I think also the level of skilling the whole population, if you want, is going to be important. So I hope CHIPS Act also, but in general, not just CHIPS Act, as Bart said, all of the other incumbent acts and policies and movements need to bring the whole population, the whole citizen into this new era, and taking away concerns, which obviously there should be.
Yeah. I maybe have time for another punchy question. Keep it short, keep it tight. Yeah, there.
Thanks. I'm Megan Richards. I want to ask you a question, particularly of IMEC, but to everyone. IMEC, of course, got a lot of its support initially through the European research funding, and we have the next multi-annual financial framework coming up soon with, of course, a proposal for a lot of research and innovation. How do you see, and where should this be concentrated in order to advance more some of the issues that you're relating to? Should it be across the board, AI development in all different sectors? Should it be focused on AI specifically? Or is it too little too late?
Thank you. And well, first answer to your question, CHIPS Act 2 should double down on the initial investments of CHIPS Act 1. So it's going to be important to have a strong pillar 1. Innovation is something that is a long haul thing. So it needs to be a constant thing that Europe needs to focus on. The other thing is across sectors, I think it needs to start from the sectors, by the way. So we need to look at, and the value chain discussion came up, we really need to look at the end market, at the use case, and build the use case into the strategy. That's the way we function. That's the way some of our colleagues function. That's the way industry functions. But with partitioning the industry, getting less verticalized, as we used to have in the early days, and it's coming back, companies often lose sight of where, you know, their competition may be surprising them. And I think that's also where the whole policy should look at. It has come up, but just repeating it, every sector should have its own plan introducing AI or introducing digitization. It's not only AI in its operation. That will make Europe strong. Actually, we do have a lot of strengths in that industry part, for instance. We can build on robotics. We can look at defense also there, make sure public procurement, and Bart said it, is leading the way. But yeah, no, it needs to build up pillar 1, 2, 3, and maybe a bit, you know, more focused on per sector, how pillar 3. And so watching your value chain, taking away choke points is going to be introduced. So it's tough.
Okay, thanks for that answer. I think we have to wrap it up with questions, regrettably. I have one final one for all the panelists. If we meet again, let's say in 1 month or 2 months, and I ask you to answer with one line or maybe two. When would you be happy with the second CHIPS Act? Let's start with you, Jo.
Well, iterating maybe on my last answer, making sure that there's a strong commitment to double down on what the initial stakes of CHIPS Act 1 were. Setting the mission differently in percentage of markets, maybe that's not the best choice, but looking at sectors and looking at the choke points of the value chain and making sure that we have something to offer. And I think it's going to be there. I'm optimistic.
Eva?
Well, I said it earlier, I think we have to be indispensable, but I think in political terms, we need to understand that chips are the backbone of AI, defense, industry, and so we need to understand that this is a talk not about technology, it's about power. So we definitely have to make sure that with CHIPS Act 2 and all the other files accompanying this vision, we get it right.
Design and fabless at its core, because that's where the economic growth is for Europe, but enabling, doubling down, trebling down, quadrupling down on all indispensable items that we have. And it's not just the indispensability on the most like lithography tech that we have, it's also about analog nodes, which can be very indispensable. So we should think with a new way of what is indispensability for Europe and quadrupling down on that.
Yeah. I keep in mind that CHIPS is a story about power and that we should think about how Europe can be indispensable in this story about power. I want to thank you all for your very insightful remarks and your knowledge. Up next, I want you all to stay seated because up next we will have my colleague Elisa Gricci moderate a panel with 2 founders and CEOs to explore the future of European startups. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.